Welcome to Rainbow Records, a show about the stories of queer people who lived through the AIDS crisis in Los Angeles. Stories of resistance, resilience, and a community that refused to be erased. I'm your host, Analisa Venolia. This episode is a mid-season interlude. We're going to go over the modern queer history of Los Angeles leading up to the AIDS crisis, so that listeners who aren't familiar with LA's unique and valuable contributions to the queer rights movement in the U.S. can understand just how vital the city has been. Even though we're often overlooked for New York and San Francisco, we actually have some really important queer history of our own. So let's get into it. I'm going to begin this exploration of LA's queer history in the early 1900s. The history of LA, of course, begins far earlier than that, as does the queer history of the area, with indigenous peoples living here far before colonization and the existence of the U.S. However, for the purposes of this project, the early 1900s is our starting point. In the early 1900s, as people were moving out west and Los Angeles was beginning to be established as a city, queer communities began to form in LA. People were moving out west to find themselves, to be free. The West Coast was seen as a place where you could reinvent yourself, in contrast to the stuffy East Coast. The queer community in Los Angeles really began to grow in the 1920s, due in large part to the rise of Hollywood. The queer community was already connected to the art scene and to theater, so as the film industry began to take hold in the city, more queer people moved to LA to participate in the growing artistic field. And LA offered more privacy than New York for queer people because of its layout. LA is a sprawling city, very spread out, while New York is incredibly compact. In LA, there would be less people in your business because of the sprawl, whereas in New York, because everything is so condensed and the population is stacked on top of each other, more people could know what you were up to. So, with the artistic scene growing in the city, and the city's expanding sprawl offering a bit more privacy than the compact New York, the queer community continued to grow in Los Angeles. During the 1920s in LA, there was also a degree of acceptance and appreciation for overt challenges to gender norms and gender expressions. For a couple decades prior, across the country, and even in Europe, female impersonators were popular stage performers. These men would dress up as women, sing, dance, and perform on stage, and truly convince their audiences that they were women before revealing themselves to be men at the conclusion of their performances. One of the most popular female impersonators was Julian Eltinge, who made his home in Silver Lake, a neighborhood in LA. He was in many Hollywood films, even appearing alongside Rudolph Valentino. Performers like Eltinge were welcomed in the city in the 1920s. While there is much speculation about Eltinge's sexuality, and nothing has been confirmed, the art of female impersonation undeniably pushed gender norms, as does queerness. And as the queer community of LA grew, popular cruising locations began to emerge in the 20s, like Pershing Square and Griffith Park. However, things took a turn in the 1930s. The Great Depression happened, and along with the anxieties and uncertainties of the Depression came increased moral outrage towards and increased policing of the queer community. Additionally, the Communist Party began to grow, as did opposition to their activity. Individual activity and identity began to become linked culturally, creating what we now call identity politics. As a result of World War II, Los Angeles in the early 1940s was more accepting of queer identity and activity than the 1930s, with gender roles already being turned on their head as women entered traditionally male-dominated workforces, on top of gay men creating community in the military. Gay and lesbian bars began to emerge in the city. Gay bars especially were places where gay and straight people could mingle while enjoying entertainment. However, this did not last long, as the end of the war brought with it widespread social attempts to return to traditional gender norms. Opposition to the Communist Party grew after World War II, as did homophobia. And now, some of you might be wondering why I keep mentioning communism in this discussion of the queer history of Los Angeles. That's because the persecution of queer people and of Communist Party members directly led to the creation of one of the first gay rights organizations in the United States, right here in Los Angeles. Post-World War II in Los Angeles, gay men were being arrested and losing their jobs as a result of their sexuality. Lesbians were facing the possibility of losing legal access to their children because of their identities. And members of both communities were being sent to sanitariums. This intense and quite literal persecution caused Harry Hay, a gay man and a member of the Communist Party USA, to form the Mattachine Society in 1950 in Los Angeles. The Mattachine Society's mission was to protect and fight for the legal rights of gay men. The society was incredibly influential, not just in Los Angeles, but across the country. One magazine, the first gay magazine in the United States, was published by members of the Mattachine Society. And the society's advocacy led to the first successful dismissal of a criminal charge for homosexuality due to entrapment in the city. Also, the society took a case all the way to the Supreme Court, where the court ruled that the Los Angeles post offices could not stop one magazine from distributing their issues. On top of one of the first gay rights organizations being formed in the city, Los Angeles actually had queer protests and riots years before Stonewall occurred. What some historians consider to be the very first modern queer uprising in the United States happened in LA in 1959. Protesting a police raid and fed up with the continual harassment they faced from police, gay men and lesbians rioted at Cooper's Donuts, which was a popular hangout for queer people at the time. And that brings us to the 1960s, where the counterculture movement of the time created the perfect atmosphere for the queer liberation movement to come. On a national level, in 1965, the first public demonstration in front of the White House for gay rights occurred, and 2 years later, in 1967, another queer protest erupted in Los Angeles. Police had arrested 14 queer people for kissing to celebrate the new year in a raid of a tavern called the Black Cat. In response, in February of that year, more than 200 queer people protested in front of the tavern and were met with armed police opposition, although no one was arrested. And in 1968, an openly gay reverend named Troy Perry founded the Metropolitan Community Church in Los Angeles and welcomed queer members. The church would later play a huge role in the way the AIDS crisis was handled in the city. The Stonewall riots, of course, occurred in June of 1969, and the queer community of Los Angeles blossomed following them. The Gay Community Services Center, now known as the Los Angeles LGBT Center, was founded in 1969 and opened its doors in 1971. Gay-ins were held in Griffith Park as a space for the community to gather, organize, and connect. And the gay club scene exploded in West Hollywood during the disco era, alongside a rise in drug use and the practice of unprotected sex in the gay community. Also, something I find especially interesting is that in December of 1969, only months after Stonewall, members of the Gay Liberation Front in Los Angeles proposed taking over the Eastern Californian community of Alpine County and turning it into an all-gay community. It would have its own service systems and museums of art and gay history. This gay nationalist idea faced much opposition, and following Christians' threats to respond if action was taken, it ultimately died in 1971. Even though nothing ultimately came of this idea, I still think it's an interesting piece of LA queer history. And while this explosion of sexual liberation was happening in the 1970s, the lesbian community intentionally diverged from the gay male community due to the feeling that gay men did not care to advocate for issues affecting queer women, only themselves. Lesbians were still facing legal battles over custody for their children, and they were also suffering from high rates of breast cancer. However, the gay male community largely did not join them in their activist efforts, and so a division was created. This division happened across the country, but it was also felt on a local level, occurring even here in Los Angeles. And that brings us to the 1980s. 1980 was still a period of sexual liberation for gay men. And then, as our first guest Michelle Chanel testified in the very first episode of Rainbow Records, AIDS was discovered in Los Angeles in 1981. I hope that brief overview of the modern queer history of Los Angeles was informative, and that it gave you a better understanding of what led up to the topics that are discussed by the guests of the show. And I hope you now have more of an appreciation for LA's role in the queer history of the US and the fight for queer rights. This has been Rainbow Records. Until next time.